If your longest tenured front desk person, billing person, or medical assistant gave notice tomorrow, what would that do to your practice? How much time and energy and revenue and patience would you lose if they walked out the door without any notice? Is anybody else in your practice at an 80% or more competency to take over their role? If you answered no to any of these questions, then you're going to want to tune into this week's episode because this is exactly what we're diving into this week. And I refer to it as the knowledge gap. And that revenue gap is costing your practice more than anything you're doing with marketing. If we haven't met yet, I'm Elisa Connor, and I show up here every week to help both specialty medical practices and professional service organizations grow, not by outspending their competitors, but instead by creating not only patient and customer experiences, but employee experiences that they can't wait to tell others about. This week, we are diving into one of the big leaks that I find in most practices, and that is what I call the knowledge gap. And this affects practices not only financially, but it also affects practices in the way that they're able to build their culture. And we're going to not only dive into what this is costing your practice and likely some of the things you've tried to circumvent the knowledge gap, but also what your competitors are doing differently and why they're being successful and unfortunately attracting some of your best employees to come work for them. And most importantly, what you can do about it. Where most practices struggle when it comes to the knowledge gap is that they are focused on the people rather than the processes and systems and even technology that would support those people. And what I find with most specialty practices that are privately owned is that they haven't taken the time to, one, adjust, create, or optimize those processes if they even exist at all. And two, that they haven't caught up to what their competitors are already doing. When the knowledge of your practice lives inside of a person, you're putting yourself and your practice in a really precarious position. If you have one person that knows the exact way that each of your referring physicians wants to be contacted, whether that's email or fax or a different way, or you have one person in your office that is responsible for that one patient who always wants an 8 a.m. slot, or you have somebody in your office who has been doing the job for so long that the position has changed dramatically, but they've never written down any of those changes, you're putting yourself in a very dangerous position. And the reason being is that if you have looked at any statistics about not only front desk help, medical assistants, and billing assistants, but anyone in your practice, the churn rate for those positions is growing higher and higher, specifically in the medical industry. And a lot of that is due to burnout. And I attribute it personally, and I'm sure you do too, to COVID. People in the healthcare industry were so inundated and pushed to their limits. And frankly, they've never been given the opportunity or the encouragement to step out of that fight or flight mode. And to be a thriving practice in the future, you have to take that into consideration and make those jobs easier, or you're going to continue to attract not ideal candidates. And when those candidates find a higher paying position, they're out the door. There's no loyalty or commitment to your practice. And so how do you build that and how do you evolve that? That's what we're going to dive into. But first, let's talk about some of the costs associated with turnover. Now, you may be thinking, oh, it's just the cost of replacing the position. So that would be the average salary. I think I looked up was somewhere between $38,000 and $50,000 a year for a front desk person. Unfortunately, especially when you're looking at a front desk person, to replace that person can be almost double of what that salary is. When you include into that the accounting costs, the training costs, the recruitment costs, the costs for that person to get up and to a level of productivity, and the lost time it takes them to be actually productive in their role. That's just the tip of the iceberg. If we were looking at that position and we're looking at just from a financial dollar amount, that position being around $38,000, it will actually cost your practice almost $76,000 to replace them by the time you incorporate all of those different costs. And that's what practices aren't looking at. And when you have a high turnover rate, which we're going to get into in just a little bit in this episode, we're going to get into exact statistics. It is not just that one person you're replacing. It is likely that role that you're replacing again and again throughout the year. So then you have to multiply that by the number of times that you have to recruit and replace that position. So if you have 2 front desk people and they both leave in a year, that's 76,000 times 2 on the low end. And that's a lot of money for a practice when you're trying to gain revenue and not lose it. So oftentimes people think, oh, automatically our revenue is because we don't have enough patients. And it could be that you just have other revenue that's leaking through the cracks. And that's why I want to help you bring awareness to it. So there are some other areas that are affected by that turnover. And there are probably areas that you hadn't even considered being connected to the loss of that role or other roles that I've mentioned so far, those being billing or medical assistants, but specifically the front desk. If you lose a front desk person, you also can be losing revenue from missed inbound calls. So if you're down to 1 receptionist instead of 2, half of the people that would normally be answered, going through a phone call aren't getting the phone answered. So, and if you don't have online scheduling, which many of the practices I look at do not, those patients are going somewhere else immediately. They are not going to wait for you to fix your problem. And so that makes it even more stressful for you and your team while you're trying to find somebody to fill in at the front desk. And that means other things are falling through the cracks. If you have someone just filling in to answer phones from another part of the organization, that person likely doesn't know the entire process to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And that leads us to the second place that you could be losing revenue or where you have to spend more time collecting it. That is when that person answering the phone isn't collecting service fees, like copays, for example. If they forget to collect a copay, then that means somebody has to go back and collect that later. And that's more time spent with that patient that could have just been handled when they either came in the door or when the phone call was being answered. The other part where you could be leaking revenue is through claim denials. If that person is in a rush because they're not used to having the kind of stress of answering the phone, or they're not, well equipped with what things have changed since they've last perhaps been in that position or had to fill in, they may not know all of the newest rules and regulations for insurance data information. And so if you don't have the right information collected from that patient, that can lead to claims being denied or rejected or in whatever way, shape, or form not being paid. And so then you have to go back and have either the billing person resubmit the claim, go back to the patient, get the right insurance information, all of that, because the person that was filling in when the original person left that position didn't know exactly what the expectations were. And then the last part, which is a little bit beyond control, is you will have increased patient no-shows because you have one person that they are used to having a backup to help them at that front desk full time. And if they don't have someone, it's left completely on them. And that means that different things are going to fall through the cracks. So if you don't have someone that can follow up and leave messages for patients or push out the notifications or whatever it is in your office, you're going to have increased no-shows, which means decreased revenue again. So all of those different items are aligned with losing a position. Specifically, those challenges deal with the front desk, but there are other challenges that apply to different positions. And I will let you, when we get into the action plan, define what those things are. So some of the things that most practices usually try to solve this problem are to improve onboarding or to offer more competitive salaries or to build company culture and give people the ability to move throughout the organization into higher level positions, or having more flexible scheduling so that they can work around their daily lives. And that works to a point. But when we start to look at the statistics from MGMA, we find that 29% of practices still report that they have climbing churn when it comes to their team because of ongoing staff burnout. And I mentioned a little bit about how COVID sent everybody into a reactive mode. And I think a lot of practices and a lot of the healthcare industry has not recovered from that because it is a very high intensity environment where you have a lot of competition and everybody wants to do their best all the time. And that is almost impossible for any human. But on top of that, they haven't had the time to kick back and set up processes or evaluate their processes. And I am very aware of that. I'm completely aware that practices are doing the best that they can. However, not taking the time to create those processes and the things that will optimize your practice overall are actually not only costing you revenue, they're costing you your best employees. And that's where we dive into our second statistic is from First HR. That statistic stated that 47% of practice leaders said that filling their medical assistant role has been the most difficult role to not only fill, but retain. And there's a couple of reasons why. And the reason that that role is really hard to not only fill, but also retain is that you have a few things working against you. One is that a lot of people that are in that medical assistant role feel like they are boxed in, that there's no growth opportunity and that they can only reach a certain financial level and then that's it. They're cut off from any other opportunities. The other challenge that faces this group specifically is the lack of processes and the inability to adapt to things that could be automated. And this specifically challenges smaller practices and practices that are privately owned because most big healthcare practices have already adopted not only the technology that they need for online scheduling and things like that, but also are now moving into the world of AI to make it even easier. Often this position also struggles with any kind of onboarding, and if the onboarding exists at all, it's not terrific. They are the dumping ground for everyone else's problem, just as the front desk is, which makes it even harder to retain or recruit them. But someone is doing it right. And unfortunately for you, that is your competitors. They have figured out a lot of the things that cause this position to have stress. When those medical assistants find out that your competitors not only have easy onboarding, but they have put into place the structures and the processes and the systems to make their job easier, things like online scheduling, operating procedures, shared knowledge banks. They have a complete documentation system that allows them to focus on patient care, not the processes and systems behind that. So they're actually getting to do what they want to do. Now, that can seem a little intimidating and overwhelming if you are a physician owner in a practice and you're like, I'm trying to do the best I can. You are. And it's not a skills gap, it's a bandwidth gap. You only have what you have available, but you do have the opportunity to optimize some of the processes and things that are going on in your office to not only make that position's job easier and more consistent, but also the other positions in your office. And we now have the tools and technology to do that quickly, efficiently, and effectively so that you can move forward doing the things that you want to do and not just focusing on running your practice. It's not your fault that nobody trained you to do 2 full-time jobs at one time, but it is your fault if you keep continuing to do both of those roles and not get the support and help you need to allow you to step out of one of them. So if you tune into these episodes weekly, you know we do something called practice math. And practice math is math that you can actually apply to your own practice to see where you're leaking revenue. And this week, our practice math is going to be specifically for replacing one of your medical assistants because there are so many practices that are not only losing this position, but also having to refill it fairly regularly. I thought it would be beneficial for you to do this math with me. So to do this for your own practice, I always recommend getting a piece of paper. Now, if you're driving, don't do the math while you're driving, do it later. But if you are sitting somewhere where you can pull out a piece of paper, it would be helpful for you to start calculating your revenue loss specifically for this right now. So according to MGMA, there is a 25 to 35% turnover rate for medical assistants and a 40% annual turnover rate for front desk positions and a 33.3% turnover rate for billing and business operations positions. We're just going to look at medical assistants right now. The average salary of a medical assistant is around $50,000. Now, it could range anywhere between $48,000 and $65,000, depending on where you live, your cost of living, all of those different things. We're going to use $50,000 because it's a nice even number for us to do our math. So we will look at a practice that has 6 physicians. Now we are going to look at a 1-to-1 ratio so that those 6 physicians each have 1 medical assistant. So we're looking at a total of 6 for the practice. This is where you need to plug in your own math. You might have a 1-to-2 ratio. You might have more or fewer physicians. This is where you get to plug in your numbers. If 6 of those physicians, if 25% of them, or even 30% of them, are part of that turnover, it's around 2 people a year. And so you're looking at 2 of the 6 leaving at some point within the year. So then we have to take into consideration the cost to fill that position. It's not quite as high as the front desk, but it is between 40 and 80%. So again, I split the difference and we're going to use 60%. So if we are looking at a $50,000 salary and we're looking at 60% of that, it's about $30,000. And if we multiply that times the 2 positions, that's $60,000. When we look at that, and then we look at what it costs for somebody to actually be in that position, you're paying to replace that person, you're paying the same amount that it would be that you would be paying somebody to actually be in the position. And it may be more or less for your practice. Chances are it's probably more. And so when you look at it that way, where you're just basically paying a salary to someone who's not there to replace the people that you keep losing, it may make you want to look at solving the problem more quickly. This also doesn't take into consideration the loss of productivity for that person being replaced and that person coming up to speed. Press Ganey also did a survey and found that 10% of patients were less happy when there was a structural challenge happening within the organization. They were more likely to give lower reviews when there was a staff change because things were out of whack, as you can imagine they would be when you were down 1 person. Now, if you look at that and you start doing the same math for your front desk and how many times that position turns over, and also for your billing systems, you can see that you have a lot of revenue walking out the door. And that's exactly what I'm going to challenge you to look at this week with your action plan. If you tune in again every week, you know that I give you an action plan to get you started in the right direction to start plugging the leaks on your revenue loss. And this week is no exception. So let's dive into this week's action plan. Step number 1 is for you to look at your practice and identify the top 3 places where you would experience a knowledge gap if you lost that specific employee. So look at departments, look at employees, and look at the roles that those employees are taking on, and determine if that person left your practice, what would happen? Would you be in a world of hurt, or would things continue as usual, or would it be complete chaos? That's a great place for you to start. When you answer that question and you realize complete chaos is in your near future, that is a great place to start. Which leads me to step number 2, which is have each of those people document the top 10 recurring tasks that they take on and complete every single day and put them into a living document. So whether that is a spreadsheet or a Word document or an online portal that you use for your processes, whatever that may be, and continue to have them add to that list as time goes on. So the top 10 is probably just icing on the cake. They probably have hundreds of things that they handle regularly. If you can get them into the practice of just jotting down a note of something they take care of so that you have at least a guide for what they're handling, then you know a few things. 1, you know exactly what's being taken care of and you can reward them effectively. 2, make a knowledge-based assumption about what is going on in that position and whether or not you need to add another position to take some of that role off of that person so that they stay, or fill the job effectively in the future if they leave. And then the third step for this process is to start to cross-train your team so that even if somebody in your organization can take on one or two of those tasks, if that person is out on vacation or falls ill or, God forbid, leaves, you at least have someone who can jump in and handle their top two priorities. When you're looking at those priorities, they should be measured by the ramifications that will happen if that person isn't in that role. So, for example, it should be patient callbacks. So those are really important. It should be scheduling and billing challenges. And then also coding submission, because if things aren't coded correctly, you're not going to get paid. So that's your action plan. Don't feel like you have to do it all right now, but get started on those 3 steps and you're going to have a full grasp on what's going on in your practice, who the real superstars are, and also a game plan for how to plan for the future. If you are wondering where to start and you're a little overwhelmed by even the action plan, then I have the perfect solution for you. I offer a 20-minute triage call. On that call, we're going to sit down and we're going to help you map out the exact spots where you are at risk of knowledge leaks and give you the opportunity to stop the leak before it walks out the door and you have to replace that person again and lose out on the revenue of replacing them instead of taking some of the challenge off of their plate and getting them to stay. If you're going to pay for someone else to be there, you might as well pay for an actual human to be there and take some of the workload off. In the meantime, I hope that you found value in this episode. And if you did, I would love for you to share it with someone else in hopes that they gain some knowledge and expertise as well. Thanks so much for tuning in this week. I'll see you next week. In the meantime, take care, be well, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.